Hello, friends, classmates. I hope that you are staying warm as the days get chillier and darker. Today we are going to talk about a little bit of Chapter 11, though not very much of it because I don't love exactly how they approach Chapter 11 in the textbook, but we'll cover all the same information. We just won't go word for word through their outline. Instead, what we're going to do is we're going to talk about what your final project in here is, just a little bit, just to get you started. And then we're also talking about brainstorming and how to then look at our brainstorm and make sure that it can translate into some kind of organized outline that's going to have a thesis eventually, even though the bulk of this week will just be picking something initially. So the final assignment is going to be that you guys are going to do each a mini lecture. And I call it a mini lecture because it's going to be about 5 or 10 minutes. It's going to be a video recording, and it's going to be mostly informative. So you can see in the assignment that it says informative and argumentative. And we'll get deeper into that in just a minute when we start to tackle Chapter 11. But part of what I mean by that is that everything has an argument. Everything that's successful has a strong argument. So it's not that you're going to, be fighting into the camera and arguing. It's just that you're going to have a strong thesis statement to go along with something that is mostly informing us. Everything has a slant, and we just want to know what it is. We'll talk about that again in a minute. So it's going to be a mini lecture, 5 to 10 minutes of video recording. The easiest to do is to record it on your computer and then to upload it to YouTube while also giving us a transcript. You're going to be able to pick whatever topic you like. Some topics that have worked successfully for people in the past have been things like the 3 factors that every successful Olympics has in common is, or Birkenstocks are the best sandals because, or you should wash your hands for 30 seconds with really good soap instead of, so there's always an argument, and then they always explain why Birkenstocks are the best sandals, and then why, what defines a successful Olympics? It was an economic phrase for that particular one, and what those 3 factors are. And this all started from just sitting in class and deciding what are things that we already obsess about. What are things that we actually want to talk about for 5 to 10 minutes? What are those things? And, it can be Birkenstocks, it can be Olympics. I've had someone explain why Western saddles are better than English saddles for horseback riding. Virtually anything that captures your interest that is classroom appropriate, that you can tackle in 5 to 10 minutes, and that you want to talk about for 5 to 10 minutes, that you already know quite a bit about, even though you're probably going to have to do more research and citation for this project. Still pick something that already is tugging at your brain. Maybe one of your favorite rants that is classroom appropriate. Probably shouldn't do anything political, especially because the presidential election and many others will be done by the time you actually turn this project in. So maybe pick something slightly less controversial and classroom appropriate. And this is going to end up being something that you turn in as an introduction with a strong thesis statement and a strong conclusion and a roughly organized outline. Even though when you're giving a presentation, you do not have to point for point follow your outline. Instead, you could do note cards or bullet points or a slideshow. Anything like that could work, but you'll still have to have an outline to prove that you took this favorite rant, this favorite topic, and organized it into really easy to follow trajectory and points, which we'll do another week. And then also there's going to have to be a bibliography. You do not have to write a paper. There is no paper to go along with the introduction or conclusion. There is only the outline and a bibliography, so that you can really clearly spell out for all of us what your sources were. And the sources will be done in an MLA format, just like this is for a research paper. but you don't actually have to write the research paper. You're going to speak the research paper for 5 or 10 minutes. And then we will be talking a lot about fight or flight and stress responses and anxiety before we get to this project. So if the moment I said that you had to video record yourself, you had a little panic attack, that's okay. Having anxiety and panic and nervous twitches all about giving speeches is completely standard. And we'll talk a lot about that and how to get out of fight or flight. And then we'll just implement that, right? Like, you don't have to have a really fancy style. I'm sorry, my children are yelling outside my office. Isn't that useful? And then in addition to coping with fight or flight, there will also be 3 learning aids. Namely, like when I tell you to pause a video or to go play an online game or something of that nature, something that is often a source. It may be a source for your information. It may be an example, can be an image that you've posted for us, a link you've posted for us, something you want to stand up and try. I've had someone tell us to stand up and hold a ping pong ball at eye level and try to drop it directly from one hand to one foot, about hand-eye coordination. So 3 little teaching aids of some variety: link, image, exercise, etc. And then also you're going to have to give feedback. So we will post these our second to last week of class, and in the last week of class we'll be giving each other feedback on the videos. So that is the basic outline of what is going to happen. It's going to be a mini lecture, 5 to 10 minutes, video. At least you get to do it online. You don't actually have to stand up in front of the group and do anything. Yeah, so I've posted the outline for the assignment and the basics of the assignment. So check those out. And if you have any questions, feel free to email me. But also don't panic, because this is just the beginning. This is the beginning of this assignment. Really right now, all we're going to do is brainstorm and start to organize our brainstorms just a little bit. So brainstorming is the main point of what we're going to do today. But it is worth noting that brainstorming is a tiny portion of Chapter 11. And in the beginning, they tell you that your steps such as brainstorming and researching and refining and organizing will be really different depending on the kind of project. And they try to break down the kind of projects really specifically. And I would argue that they are a giant Venn diagram. One of those diagrams where the circles of informative, for example, are here and persuasive is over here. And usually there's this little center part that is what we're doing. So we're going to argue as we proceed through these styles that we're doing just about all of them. Informative is a style that's included in your textbook. And informative basically means that you are trying to inform. You are going to educate your audience about something. I would argue that you can't do this without making a strong thesis statement. That even a recipe has a really strong thesis statement if it's a good one. If it's a good recipe for pie crust, it's not just informing you of the exact ingredients you need and the process to make. It is telling you the importance of it, which is its thesis statement. It could be saying using completely butter and no lard is how to make the best pie crust. That could be its thesis. It could be use vodka instead of water. That could be its thesis. You need to bake it first for 10 minutes before you add any filling. You need to let it rest overnight in the freezer before you use it the next day. All of these things could be their thesis statement, and it basically just lets you know that the author understands their own slant. Everything has a slant. Everything has a bias. That if even a recipe, a good one, has some kind of slant, it is certainly true of any mini lecture that we could give each other. So the informative style of educating us about something cool like Birkenstocks or successful Olympic parties or certain kinds of saddles has to have an argument. It wasn't just a long, meandering discussion of what is the definition of a Western saddle. It was that Western saddles are easier and more elegant than English style saddles. So there's going to be an argument. There's going to be a slant. It's kind of this declarative, here's what I'm really telling you. We'll talk more about thesis statements in a little while, but a strong informative should still have that. And then your book talks about persuasive. And persuasive is that everything is built about hammering home that thesis. But as it turns out, even informative stuff has to have that thesis statement constantly in mind. Everything should reference back. In an informative, in a research, it's still referencing back to that thesis. And if you can't do it, it usually means you're not organized or pointed or well-researched enough. So in order to be persuasive, you have to be informative, right? And then they give this second or this third category of entertaining, that giving an entertaining speech would be different. But in order to be entertaining, you also have to be somewhat informative. You still have to give an introduction to the information. You have to be on level ground. The joke doesn't make any sense if you haven't established some kind of baseline for everyone. Or introducing. If you're just introducing someone, you still at least have to be well-researched and organized enough to say the person's name, etc. Same for giving honor. If you're giving a eulogy, even if your research is just thinking back through your own stories of a person, I swear to you, all of these styles are very, very easily combined, and that almost all of them, when they're doing it right, are organized very similarly, are all being slightly entertaining, are all being appropriate to the crowd, just like when you're giving honor, are still introducing at least information, if not a real person, and are being persuasive and have a strong thesis. When they're introducing somebody, they don't usually have a weak thesis of, here's that guy. They know the name and they say, here's the wonderful, magnificent Harry Potter. They know the name and they toss some adjectives that make a really strong thesis. They're not leaving you to decide whether or not Harry Potter is magnificent. They're going to go ahead and announce it with that really strong thesis. So I would argue that all these styles of presentation go together. And that's why in your mini lecture, it is going to be informative and argumentative. Again, not argumentative in that you're going to like argue something at us, but argumentative in that it will have a strong thesis and be well organized, even if it's entertaining and introducing us to new information that is informative and well researched. And that's how we all go together. So now that you know the gist of what you're going to have to do, combining all those styles in a 5 to 10 minute informative, argumentative mini lecture, tell us about something, you have to start to decide what it is that's grabbing your brain. What is it that you want to talk about for 5 to 10 minutes? Like I said, it can be really useful to pick an argument about a favorite hobby, like Birkenstocks, or to pick a favorite rant, like about saddles, or to dig into something that you've been obsessing about for another class. If you have an econ class where you're studying the economic impact of Olympics, that might be a perfect project. Something that you actually want to talk about for 5 to 10 minutes that you can find enough information about to give the whole 5 or 10 minutes. And part of how you know if you have enough information and if you can formalize it enough to have a few really solid sources, which we'll talk about in another week, is to start brainstorming. You take the topic that grabs your brain and you start scribbling your notes about it, or typing if you prefer to type. That's fine too. I happen to be a scratch paper person. I like to draw myself the classic web kind of thing where I have different notes on each part of the page and then I can draw lines or number them in the order that I want them to be. And you can see evidence of this in our example. I took a picture of a classroom brainstorm that I replicated one day for a class that sat in physically a classroom. So I've attached the picture for you here so that as I go through the kind of meandering, discussing version of brainstorm that I'm reenacting, that did happen in real life, you can see how I laid it out on the board. And that's often what my scratch paper looks like too. If you're somebody who types, that's fine. If you type things out of order, that's fine. What you want to do for this class is to, before you start to put it in super formalized order, save a version, save a draft, make a copy of the unorganized, where you kind of just spilled it out, stream of consciousness, which is a little bit hard for me too. I like to put things in order right away, but we'll see in this example why that doesn't always work. So pause for a moment, take a look at the image of the brainstorm, and then you can maybe even pull it up on your screen and just listen to my audio while you're looking at the board, and you can see where I scribbled down some of these notes. They won't match exactly, but it's a very accurate representation of what actually happened to me in a history class. I had a history class that was a class revolving around a big thesis project, which is, you know, like a 50-page paper, a history paper. And the name of my thesis class was Rebels, Dissidents, and Iconoclasts in 20th Century US. So everybody in the class, including me, was aimed at looking for outliers and the wackiest and the most bizarre and just, you know, really outlying figures in history. So with this in mind, I went to just a regular family gathering. And really informally, my family was just talking about this guy named Fred Smith. They were chatting about him, and their whole thing was, have you heard of Fred Smith? Oh my gosh, yeah. He lived right by Grandpa, right over by Grandpa's house. You know how Grandpa does wrought iron sculpture with welding. He'll make like a cowboy or something, or a scarecrow out of wrought iron. Well, Fred Smith is a real character. He lives near Grandpa, and not only does he make sculptures out of wrought iron, but around the frame of wrought iron, he adds in concrete and then covers them with glass and stone mosaics. It's called Fred Smith's Concrete Park, or the Wisconsin Concrete Park. And they told me I should go check it out. And I was like, oh, well, fabulous. I'm on the hunt for these bizarre characters, and it'd be great if I could check into this Fred Smith for this history project. Because as it turned out, he'd been dead for a couple decades. So I do. After this family gathering, I go home, and often, as is an initial step in research, and it's just fine as an initial step, we'll talk about refining our sources in another day, but a wonderful initial step is to Google. So I open up my computer, and I Google Fred Smith, Wisconsin Concrete Park, and it blows my mind. It blows my mind. It's bananas. Fred Smith, Wisconsin Concrete Park. Here is a link. Pause for a moment and go look at it, because you'll see why it blew my mind. So pause here and go take a look at Roadside America's story about Fred Smith and the Wisconsin Concrete Park. Feel free to announce to your roommates and your entire household what weird thing you're looking at. Pause here. Okay, so you're back. Wasn't that bananas? So I see this, and I see all these sculptures and this concrete, and it's not like anything I've ever seen before, and I don't know a ton about art, but, you know, I've walked through a couple of museums. I have some friends who are painters, so, you know, I've seen a little bit, flipped through some art books, at least know the classics from Spanish or French class in high school. You know, I saw a little bit, and I've never seen anything like this. This is wild. I've got to use this as my thesis because obviously this guy was this iconoclast and rebel and dissident. You know, he was off in the margins. This is some wild stuff. So I pick my thesis. I pick my thesis to start brainstorming about. And, you know, it's tentative. I know that I'm probably going to have to edit some of it later as I learn new information and things. But my initial stab at a thesis is that Fred Smith was a rural, uneducated, unique sculptor, and that he's just even zanier than a typical artist. If you take a typical artist who already does kind of banana stuff, and then you put somebody out in the middle of the North Woods, northern Wisconsin, and make them an artist there, that it's going to be even more bananas, right? Just like Roadside America, it's going to have these crazy sculptures. So now that I have a basic thesis, I have to find out more. And as I find out more, I was tracking my sources. So that first Google, I find him in Roadside America, right? And I immediately bookmark it. And because I do a lot of research in life, I actually also know that I should create a document that's just called Fred Smith Research. And it's a place that I can copy and paste the juiciest tidbits and the juiciest links with teeny tiny summaries so that I don't lose that information. That I don't 2 weeks later go, where did I get this information? I can't cite it. I don't know where it came from. Make yourself a little document called XYZ Research, whatever your topic is. And then just as you obsess and casually brainstorm, save the juiciest pieces so that you don't wonder where they went later. I've had students do this on Pinterest, or you can just bookmark sites. But be a little bit careful with that, because if you don't type a little summary for yourself, you could end up having to scroll all of your sources to find certain tidbits again. But anyway, so I dive in, and I start finding that maybe my first question about Fred Smith, because this is a history project, is going to be, who was this guy? Who was this guy? And so between Wikipedia and the pages that Wikipedia led me to, and this will become important later, the pages that Wikipedia led me to, I start to find out that Fred Smith was from a second-generation Scandinavian family living in northern Wisconsin. And he grew up in lumber camps, playing the fiddle and logging in the north woods of Wisconsin, and farming. That almost everybody up there did both lumber and farming, and that later in his life, he owned a bar, and he would play his fiddle at the bar that he owned, that he learned how to play in the lumber camps. I'm like, okay, all right. This is not an unfamiliar story. I mean, my whole family is from northern Wisconsin. I only got to know Fred Smith because, or hear of Fred Smith, because he lived near where my grandpa lived. And I think, okay, well, if that's who he was, what are the rest of his pieces? I'm going to need some better source material to look at here. I can't just go from the camera snaps on American Roadside. So I find some better images of his pieces, of his sculptures, from the Wisconsin Concrete Park. And I found out that almost all of them had wrought iron frames inside and then concrete shaped around them. And then they had glass and stones placed in as mosaic. And some of these sculptures were a Budweiser beer wagon, right? He makes an entire Budweiser beer wagon. He sculpts a life-size Budweiser beer wagon and the Clydesdales. And I found out that part of the way that he made those life-size is that he, not in all, but in at least some of those horses, there is a real horse skull. There is a real horse skull inside his sculpture of the Budweiser beer wagon. So this is blowing my mind. I keep finding out weirder and weirder stuff. Some of his sculptures have glass insulators that on old power and telephone lines, when they were taken down, were just discarded. So anyone walking along where old train and power line used to go can find these glass insulators in rural northern Wisconsin. You'll just be walking along what is now a walking or bike trail, or just a piece of your own property that used to have train tracks and a power line, and you'll find railroad ties, and you'll find glass insulators. He put some of those in his sculpture, and he's got Paul Bunyan and Babe the Blue Ox. He's got some different people meeting. He's got lots of crazy sculptures. I find pictures of what I think are crazy sculptures, and then I go looking for local interviews. And the way I know to go looking for this is that I ask my family members who introduced me to the concept of Fred Smith, hey, I'm going to need some local interviews. What do you know about Fred Smith? And it turns out my dad was a little young for Fred Smith. This man turns out to be a little bit older than my grandfather. So my dad doesn't know much, but he says, gosh, I really remember this one time that he was playing his fiddle for local TV, and a fiddle string snapped, and he started swearing on air. And my dad had been pretty young when this happened, so he was scandalized and delighted by getting to hear a grown man play his fiddle and then swear on live TV. So I'm just completely entranced at this point. And my real local source for interviews is going to be my grandpa. And I say, okay, Grandpa, tell me all about this Fred Smith. And he's like, oh yeah, Fred Smith. He just lived right over in Phillips. Yeah, he made some sculptures. Did a lot of lumber with his family farm, just typical stuff. I'm like, yeah, right. So tell me more. And my grandpa's kind of like, I don't know, he was an all right guy. I was like, but wasn't he kind of crazy? Didn't people think crazy things about him? And my grandpa was kind of puzzled. And he was like, no, not really. He's not that unusual. What? So now my most local source to the topic is saying, not that unusual. So I'm like, I don't know. My grandpa himself is a little out there, so maybe grandpa's wrong. I'm going to go see what the critics said. Are there any art critics from the art world who have talked about, how crazy his art is? So I go and I look up some different kinds of art that I didn't know about very well. And the first thing that usually comes up when looking about rural art is folk art. Things like quilts or beautifully carved chairs or wooden spoons or lefse paddles that have intricate carvings on the handles. But then I realized the definition of those is usually that it's both functional, it's a tool of some sort, or a working object like a chair or a quilt. It can keep you warm. It's usually related to function and then also happens to be beautiful. So there wasn't a ton about Fred Smith in there. And then I think, okay, well, what else am I going to find here? Like, what do you call, remote jungle art when it comes to light? Turns out that's called naive art. Naive art is art made by someone who is unstudied. They didn't go to art school. It tends to be called primitive, meaning they didn't have a ton of influence, and kind of rough. This idea of not very refined or considered very deeply. I'm like, well, I mean, that kind of fits. And then I'm like, well, but where's the line? Where is the line between this concept of naive art and this concept of fine art? And it turns out that when you read about fine art, they try to define themselves by being contextual, that there's a context, that they're educated, that there are long traditions of whatever the given art is, and that it's very well studied. And I start to pause. And I start to get a little insulted. I start feeling like, hey, is fine art kind of making a hick joke about everybody who's not in a museum doing watercolors? So I start to look into it a little bit more and into the definitions of fine art and naive art. And it turns out I'm not the first person who said, oh, come on, fine art's not a real thing. Don't call it naive. Don't call it primitive. And I start to think about Fred Smith in terms of these definitions. And I start to notice what my grandpa was trying to tip me off to, that the person who is most local and most primary and most inside of that context could perfectly recognize all of the context. And there was tons of context there that I just didn't realize because I was looking for an iconoclast. So his context is agriculture. That explains why there are plows and cows and horses, and logging. There are lumberjacks. There's Paul Bunyan, and beer. Of course, Northwood's context includes beer and beer bottles. Turns out that broken glass was how he was recycling the broken beer bottles from his bar. Perfectly in context. Or bones from animals that he probably knew that horse and put it to good use, and that it's not out of context for him to have access to these materials. In addition to having contextual access to the materials, he does have an education. If any of us tried to build with concrete around wrought iron, especially with stones or glass, at least our first few tries would not be very amazing. And when you look around in northern Wisconsin, especially in the Scandinavian areas, you start to see that even clothesline poles are built of concrete with stone pressed into it around a pole, Or root cellars. The part that's above ground is a concrete structure with stones that they pulled out of their farming fields. And that this education had to happen, that he was taught how to build with wrought iron and concrete and stones. And then there's also a long tradition of really specific art, that the stones and the concrete is not specific, that mosaics are everywhere. Virtually every culture that's ever done art, which is almost all of them, have had some kind of mosaic component. And that the cultural commentary, even if wildly offensive, right? Like the mythology that northern Wisconsin Scandinavians from the second generation had about their Native American Indian reservation neighbors, probably pretty offensive to us today, but it is very contextual. It is very learned and very specific. It's not simple. It's not primitive. It's not naive. It completely fits in the whole context. So after doing all of this brainstorming and tracking through all of these sites, I had been just throwing ideas out, collecting information to see what would stick. By the end of the brainstorming, I had a completely different thesis. And this often happens, and that's okay. I started talking about how Fred Smith is this bonkers, crazy out there artist, even crazier than urban artists. And then through the process of brainstorming and obsessing and tracking my brainstorm in terms of information, I got to this end point, which is that Fred Smith was not a naive artist, working without context in primitive or exotic ways. He was only as zany as every other artist. And then from that point, I could look at all these sketches and tidbits that I'd given myself. And now that I actually had some of these things in hand, I could start to lay out what I needed to formalize. So you can look again at that picture of the blackboard that is the brainstorm. That is as it flowed out onto paper originally and how I reenacted it on a marker board with a classroom. And it's how it happens again. Every time I talk about Fred Smith, I take the same journey because it seems so obvious in the beginning of the brainstorm that he's bonkers and bananas. And it seems so clear by the end of the brainstorm how to focus a project about Fred Smith and how to put him in context. So I also included the document that shows how the outline can be formalized. And this is not a super formal, this is not a super finalized draft of an outline. It is just you showing to yourself and to me and to us that this brainstorm is worthy of pursuing. So take a picture of your piece of paper brainstorm or save a copy of your typed brainstorm out of order, and then also make a slightly formalized, slightly more organized draft that begins to resemble an outline that shows that your scribbles can transform into something that you could feasibly talk about for 5 minutes. And in another week, we will talk about really formally organizing and thesis and what resources are good and about how to stay out of fight or flight. Right now, you just need to be finding a topic that your brain is latching onto and showing us that that loosely formed cloud is capable of transforming into a more solidified 5 to 10 minute mini lecture. So that's your task. Brainstorm and then show that your brainstorm is a viable brainstorm. Okay, good luck. I hope you have fun and I can't wait to see what your topics are.